This afternoon she'll be reading from and discussing her book, Healing Maddie Brees, of which you can get some copies over here afterwards. This evening she'll give a talk entitled Imagination and Truth. You'll get a more complete introduction there, but I'll just say this very quickly. Rebecca is a 1991 grad, University College, where she was a literature secondary ed major and taught both public and private settings. After leaving Grove City, earned a master's in liberal arts from Duke University. Has been a writer in addition to teacher and mother and all kinds of other things that she's been busy with. But she has a beautiful way with words, tremendous energy, and so we're looking forward to her time both this afternoon and then this evening at 7 o'clock here in the same spot for a kind of broader discussion of imagination. So turn it over to Rebecca.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. It is absolutely a joy to be here with you. I want to ask a question, if I may, here at the beginning. How many of you write? Are you writers? Are you willing to admit? I wouldn't admit it for a long time because I felt I had nothing to show for it. And so I didn't want people to ask me, how's that going? The answer, if anyone ever asks you as a writer, how's that going, is badly. It's going very badly. But it is so, so good of you to be here, because if you're a writer, then you know, and Dr. Stansberry and I were laughing about this a moment ago, writing is necessarily an absolutely solitary thing. You must be alone. Maybe some of you can write in a coffee shop or in a place where you're just able to tune out others. But for me, it's just an act of going off and being by myself. And yet, the thing that drove me was to get this out, or whatever it is I'm working on, to say something. And so obviously, even in that solitude, the reality is that you have someone, maybe faceless, on the other side of this project that you're wanting to reach. And so it is such a gift to me that you're here. Because here we are, this thing that had me alone in my room, alone in the library, alone in the coffee shop, results in this time with you. And it is nothing short of a gift to me that you would come. So thank you for that. My novel is called Healing Maddie Brees. And before I begin, I'll tell you how I've structured this, because here's the danger. I am a mother of 3 children who no longer will sit still for me to read to them. So my love of reading aloud is really foundering. There's nobody for it, except now here you are. And I have an hour for this, so buckle up. No, I'm kidding. It occurred to me that I should sort of find a structure for this. And if possible, I would love for there to be some give and take. I don't know if any of you have read the book, and so I don't assume that you would have a response, but I don't need this to be just me the whole time. Nonetheless, I have kind of created a structure that will, I hope, give you a sense of what this book is and how I worked it, if you will, how I put it together, so that these readings will make sense in a context for giving you a scope for the project that it was. In light of that, I need to give you a summary to begin, and I have a funny story for you. Are any of you familiar with a man named Andy Crouch? He is recently retired, or moved on, I shouldn't say retired, recently moved on from his position as editor of Christianity, executive editor of Christianity Today. And my husband and I know him just have had a few opportunities to engage with him over the years, and saw him last April when he came to speak at an event in Chapel Hill, which is near where we live. And my husband wrote to him in advance of the visit and just said, "Andy, would you be willing to read Rebecca's book?" It was too late at that point for Andy to write anything that would give me kind of a praise or an encouragement. That's something that you look for when you're being published. Not only that, but Mr. Crouch does not read or promote fiction. That's just not part of what he does. So he wasn't able to do that. But it's still helpful to have somebody who has influence read your book and know that they like it and talk about it or what have you. So we met him at this event that was a dinner. And we're going through the food line and talking as we go through. So it's, you've got this much time to get your food, and I'm talking to Andy, and he says to me, "So give me a summary of your book." And I'm thinking to myself, literally, that was what was going through my brain. But it took me 300 pages to say this, so why should I be able to give you a summary for this book? It seems like a mean question, right? Here. This is what I wrote. Don't make me summarize it. So I stumbled over the summary very, very badly. And my beautiful husband, who's here standing, was listening to me. And when I finished my summary, he said, "You're going to need to get better at that." And he's right. The problem is, and this was so gratifying to me, I handed Mr. Crouch the book on Thursday, and on Sunday he got back to me, having read the entire thing. And one thing that he said to me that was really helpful was that he said, my book is very complex. And I said, see, there's your trouble. How do I summarize it? It's very complex, Andy Crouch, and all of you sitting there waiting to hear my summary, so I'm going to try. Here we go. This is the story of a marriage. Maddie Brees and Frank Brees. They've been married for, I think, 17 years at the time the book begins. And they have knitted or created for themselves a marriage that is built on honesty and trust. They really had a beautiful vision for what marriage could be when they got married. Then Maddie is diagnosed with breast cancer. And suddenly this illness is forcing her to think back on and remember a year when she was 16 years old, living in Pittsburgh. And she had gone at that time to a very conservative church. And this is a place where the book has some of my own experience in it. She went to a very conservative church of the type that you may be familiar with, or if you haven't experienced it yourselves, you may have seen it in film or movies. The kind of church that meets on Sunday morning and again on Sunday night and again on Wednesdays. The kind of church that on Sunday evenings religiously, and I use that term fully, has an altar call so that people come forward. Any of you familiar with this kind of thing? This is the sort of church that Maddie went to. And in that context of kind of a feverish belief, she knew a boy and dated a boy and thought she fell in love with a boy who, it would seem, had this gift of healing people. But she has always maintained with Frank, and she and Frank, her husband, have talked very openly and honestly about their marriage. That's my sister. She lives in Massachusetts. That's on film too. Great. She's always told Frank, in relating this story about dating this boy Vincent, that this belief that he could heal people, no matter how many times he seemed to heal people, it was always a misapprehension. It was sort of a thing that they believed because of the emotional fervor surrounding their faith. In fact, she has not just rejected the idea that Vincent could heal, but she has rejected that kind of Christianity. She has rejected that church. And in marrying Frank, she's converted to Catholicism. And this is her practice and her belief, and it's Frank's practice and Frank's belief. But when Frank hears these stories about Vincent healing people or not healing people, he always has this little snag in his mind because he says, you know, Maddie, it really sounds like Vincent did heal people. And I know you say it didn't happen, but it sounds like he could. And that is the structure or the crux of the whole book. It goes back and forth between Maddie's current dealing with this terrible disease and Frank dealing with it with her to this memory of this year in her life. And she begins to process again what happened to her and what she saw and what she did and how she thought about things and kind of relives that whole experience. I did not say that well to Andy Crouch as I was getting my lentils and chicken in the food line. Nonetheless, he read the book. So in light of that, I'm going to begin by reading you this passage because this introduces, it summarizes in a way the conflict or the place where Frank stands when he thinks about Vincent. More and more, Frank found himself thinking of Vincent. He had never met him, of course, and the scene his name conjured in Frank's mind was somehow neither that of the episode with Willie in the pouring rain, nor of Maddie lying in the school parking lot, but rather of the football game. The game was a lesser-known event in the Vincent saga, not one that Maddie was given to repeat. It was less fantastic, less striking, less clear in terms of credibility. But it was the story that Frank saw most vividly. He imagined what it might have been like had it been true, that Vincent had actually healed one of his opponents. Frank would have liked to write about it. He sees Vincent now, out near the 50-yard line, where he bends on one knee over the injured kid on the football field. Frank himself stands on the sidelines, the chill of a Pittsburgh November seeping through his jacket as he watches the coaches clustered on the field. Then suddenly the knot loosens and expands, and the injured boy is on his feet, moving, walking away from Frank and toward his team. The stands erupt with cheering. Coaches watch him go and then follow suit, moving slowly over the field. Only one figure remains, Vincent Elander, standing with his helmet under his arm, his right leg slightly bent, watching the boy he has just healed walk away. Frank imagines all of this, then sees himself walk out onto the field. Vincent's back is to him, and Frank calls him by name as he reaches him and reaches for him. He takes hold of Vincent by the arm, and Vincent turns and looks him in the eye. "Vincent," Frank says to him without hesitation, "I need you to come heal my wife." So this is actually one of my favorite moments in the book because, like I said, I move back and forth in narration from the present day, Maddie fighting this illness, Frank alongside her wanting to nurture and care for her through it, and Maddie reliving those years with Vincent. But in this one moment, I imagined a scene where Frank, in the present day, imagines himself engaging with this boy. Not actually engaging, right? It's just that moment of reaching for him. But I really enjoyed that scene. And it sets up for you that tension. So here in this marriage, we have these people committed to each other and thinking that they're like-minded. But even on this one thing, this piece of Maddie's history, they're not really at all like-minded. See, because Frank thinks maybe he could have healed her. So I'm taking a breath here just because I've been talking a long time. And they do. That's a great question. Yeah, so they have 3 sons, Jake and Eli and Garrett. And they are about 10 and maybe 7 and 4, 3 children. So that's another element of the book, is that she's mothering children as she's going through this disease, which I think would be a very challenging thing. But this piece of memory of going back and forth was a major point of interest for me. I was really grateful to get to go to a very part-time graduate program at Duke University, and I ended up thinking I wanted to study the classics. The first class I took, we reread all of Dante's Commedia, the whole thing, very long and beautiful and horrifying. The first part is especially horrifying. You know, that Inferno, everybody just eating each other's brain and everything. I'm glad I didn't live in the Middle Ages. It was a dark time. And a beautiful time. And it wasn't the middle, never mind. I ended up studying the modernists, and that was sort of a surprise to me. But one thing that the modernists loved, I think they kind of would engage a lot with this idea of memory and how memory works. And so that became a thing for me as I was thinking through the ideas in this book. And of course, as I said, Maddie spends a lot of her time remembering. I have this on my webpage, but I was very interested in the fact that one of my professors once pointed out that the word remember, if you just take it literally, the word member is the parts of something. To remember is sort of to bring those parts back, right? And we don't ever remember anything solidly. You know how your memory works, right? You'll be sitting doing something, and bam, all of a sudden some scene from some point in your life comes and it's just so powerful and so vivid, but the parts around it aren't necessarily, they don't come, chronologically, right? So this is part of what Maddie deals with, is the way these memories hit her. And my book is sort of built on that concept. Here's a place where Maddie actually engages this idea of thinking about memory. This is when she is newly ill, and she's thinking about trying not to think about Vincent because he just keeps coming to mind. Still, mind over matter wasn't effective in all arenas. Once upon a time, Maddie had worked to push thoughts of Vincent from her mind, and she had largely been successful. But lately, the memories sabotaged her. They volunteered themselves, each a small eruption triggering another that, chronologically or causally, was completely unrelated to the one before it. Kneeling next to her on the pavement, the sky pale around his bent head. He had taken off his baseball hat, and his hair was pressed in a ring. His profile, his silence, his deliberate attention to her leg and the center of the pain where the car had hit her. He hadn't even known her name. Her photo, cut unevenly from the yearbook page and stuck inside his locker door. It was a terrible picture. She didn't think until much later of him leafing through the book to find her picture, wielding the scissors, finding tape, or maybe chewing gum to hold it in place. Standing after dark in the pouring rain, allowing his own body to be the means by which a drunk and homeless man righted himself, even reaching down to take hold of his shoulders and helping the man to his feet. His patient progress through the oncology ward of the children's hospital and the way the sunlight streamed through the room, falling on and between the beds of the little sick children, their eyes over wide and dark. His head bent over Mr. Pavlik, his hands on Mr. Pavlik's swollen head, his hand on Mrs. Senchak's head, her body curled and shrunken on the hospital bed, her breath grating like a shovel over pavement. How much of it was certain? It had happened so long ago, the scenes were isolated but clear. And who was to say which ones were true memories and which imagined, things she envisioned then and now envisioned again, as clear and acute as memory? And which of them was accurate? Was that the way it had happened? He said it, and in this way? So all of those are memories that she's just gone through in her mind. They all give you little insights into moments, except for the picture in the locker, of times that he healed or she thought he healed people. But as she's, re-engaging these memories, she's wondering, am I even remembering them correctly? One of my children promotes a theory of memory, which I'm not sure I believe, but he has read it or heard it somewhere. My children are old, so I can take, there's some validity here. It's not like he's 2. My children are 20 and 18 and 16, and my 20-year-old has told me recently that the more you remember something, the less accurate it is, because you never remember it quite accurately. So then you've remembered it inaccurately, and then you remember it again, and so it's less accurate. You see what I mean? There's like an attrition there of memory. I'm not sure that's true, but who can tell you? It's just what's in your mind. There's no knowing. So this is something that Maddie is contending with. How do I even know if I remember this? And I forced myself not to think about it for so long, right? That was part of my project here. I think I just keep going. Thank you. If you all get up and leave, I'll know it's over. How's that? Really, this is such a treat for me. You're all so good. Thank you. I mean it so sincerely. Many people have asked me in reading the book, well, how much of this happened to you? And the answer is almost none of it. The things that did happen, though, I can tell you about. For example, the book almost, I should say, and for those of you who were in Dr. Harvey's class this morning, you will have heard this already, but the thing that really got me going, I think, when it was really, I had been thinking on these things for a long time, and I suddenly was able to progress, was a memory of my own. So how many of you are familiar with Pittsburgh? Pittsburgh's landscape is a very important metaphor in this novel. I grew up in the South Hills of Pittsburgh, and I said in Dr. Harvey's class this morning that Pittsburgh, I've heard it said of the city, it's the only city with an entrance. If you come into the city from the South Hills and you take the tunnel to come into the city, it's a pretty dynamic view. Exactly so, right? You're in this dark and closed tunnel, and then bam, there's the city right in front of you. And it isn't like it's far away at a distance, it's almost right here, So sometimes when I was growing up, we would take the trolley in. And this that I wrote here was all from memory. Moreover, a specific memory of that, but I wrote it in a coffee shop in Durham. And so it was interesting to see how my brain, just as I began to write it, my brain just pulled out all of these memories. I'll add here that one thing that I loved about writing about Pittsburgh was that Pittsburgh is, one thing I love about my hometown city is its grit and its imperfections. And I think this passage relates that. The trolley in Pittsburgh's Bethel Hills leaves the parking lot near the mall and follows the line of the road. Small businesses and suburban shopping centers top hills and climb the rises here, but soon enough the trolley slips behind these and is lost in a tunnel entrance lined with cement blocks, and then the dark tunnel itself. On emerging again, the view is all backyards whose far reaches are bounded by the trolley line. In her childhood days, Maddie had loved this, the surprise of the landscapes unfolding. What would lie behind that tree, beyond this rise, on the other side of the tunnel? It was delightful variance. Each emergence meant new and sudden insight, all of it life-sized. But from the vantage point of the trolley, these yards and houses were magically diminished, somehow taking on the properties of the miniature. She liked to imagine that she herself had shrunk and climbed into the electric train display her father had once taken her to see, the one where the track ran through the artificial green grass and was here and there bordered by plastic trees, the one where the little houses had the occasional plastic dog or person in the front yard, and the houses, though small, were lit by electric light. The houses from the perspective of the trolley gained this quality of stillness, of waiting to be seen, of having been prepared for this moment when the trolley would go sliding past. So whether the yard was newly mown or had at the back a neatly stacked pile of firewood, a swing set, or some things discarded, an old bicycle perhaps, a broken ladder, a pile of indistinguishable and clearly unused rubbish, Maddie imagined it whole and entire, established and set just so. This is how it was intended to be seen. A decoration, a life imagined, something distinct and safe, set apart just for the looking. The houses were old and generally tired, but many were well kept nonetheless. Yellow brick predominated here after the aluminum siding of her neighborhood, yellow and red brick and slate roofs. and then another tunnel, perhaps, and the green slope of a nearby hillside that, along with a row of trees, obscured the backyards and would have kept her guessing, except that there wasn't time to guess. There was only the next thing to see, which was that now the houses were closer together, or here they were in almost what looked like the city, but really was the suburbs more grown up. So now there were storefronts with apartments above them, a bar replete with neon sign in the window, little restaurants, a tailor, a store for coin and stamp collectors, and all of it lit in yellow or red brick or very tired-looking aluminum siding. And everywhere, at every corner, the gray concrete of sidewalk, the black pavement, the cars lining the streets, the weeds and grass and gravel collected in the cracks between. It all went by quickly enough. Here was nothing permanent. It was a memory composed of impressions. That Pittsburgh suburb should be spread like a wrinkled skirt on the other side of the mountain was nothing at all remarkable. Every city might be like this. But there was always the last dark tunnel, the long one at the nearly end, when they went through the mountain and then emerged into downtown, into the narrow, flat strip of budding water, and then the river, and then the city itself. That much Maddie knew, or thought she knew. That and the day when she and her parents took the trolley into the city in the early autumn of her junior year, and Maddie, fixed as ever to the view outside her window, saw the pedestrians going by, and saw among them Willie, the man who had been struck by the car. So that's another hint at a healing. The man who had been struck by a car. Twice in this book, someone gets hit by a car. And I wondered to myself, is that a thing I can do? Can I just have people getting hit by cars? I mean, how many people do you know who have been hit by cars? Is that a license we as authors can give ourselves? I think it was not John Irving, but I want it to be, so let's pretend. John Irving said, is that a thing you can do? It's probably not a thing you can do. I'm taking all kinds of license here. Someone who writes books said that I forget him, it was just coming to me. You walk the line in writing a book on the edge of what's believable, right? It needs to be believable or else you lose people. I don't know, unless you like things like science fiction. But those people who write science fiction also really couch that in real science, right? So it needs to be believable. And I thought to myself, can I have two people on different occasions be struck by a car in this book? And then I decided, yes, I can. And then later I made a little comment in the book about it, because Maddie at some point really wants Vincent to heal more people. Because to her, if Vincent heals people, it justifies her relationship with him. I'll make you read the book to understand that. But she wants to justify her relationship with Vincent, who becomes her boyfriend. And so she's sort of looking for opportunities for him to heal people. And so she starts watching for people to get hit by cars, which is a terrible thing. We just walk that way, quick. No, that's not, she doesn't do that. She doesn't push it that hard. But it was a question I asked myself. So a presiding question then is, could he heal people or couldn't he? She relates several stories. She has related several stories to Frank, and the novel relates several episodes or moments when he heals people. And that is one of the presiding questions of the book. Was he actually able to do so? And this question, this minor question of the tension in their marriage, is something that like memory, was another thing that really motivated me in writing this book. I am a Christian. I'm an earnest believer in Jesus Christ, and I love to read Scripture and wrestle with, kind of think on the things that the claims that Christ makes. So one thing that he says, which I find absolutely fascinating, is that when a man and woman are married, they become one flesh. And this was something that drove me in thinking about this book. What does that mean? What are you saying about the physicality of a marriage relationship? How is that supposed to work? So that's a tension that I work with. And it interests me then, in that context, that these two, who again, as I told you at the beginning, were making an effort to have a special kind of union. There's all kinds of marriages, right? But when Frank and Maddie married, they, as I said to you earlier, really were devoted to honesty and a kind of transparency in their marriage that they hoped would make their marriage really a beautiful and very successful one. But then when you disagree on something, maybe it doesn't matter, right? There are all kinds of things. I mean, my husband likes to watch sports on television sometimes. I think I want to watch sports with him. I think this will be fun. I have some friends who call it sportsing, because we're not really sportsing sorts of people. Anyone? No? You all like sports? Okay. So I like to go to games. I don't so much like to watch them on television, but I'd like to think that I'm the sort of person who likes to watch them on television. But what I found out about myself was that I would go to join him to watch the game, and I would bring something to do. And you can't bring something to do and watch the game unless you're knitting, which I don't know how to do. And so I would like bring letters to write or something. Next thing I know, I'm not watching the game. This is not relevant at all. There goes my water bottle. But the point is, we can have all kinds of places in a marriage where you're different. But what kinds of things matter to be the same, right? Where does that, did I phrase that well? Where does it matter that we agree? And where doesn't it matter that we disagree? So this is a problem for them. And here's an example of, in the book, where that becomes an issue. Frank and Maddie are on their honeymoon, and they've traveled to Italy, and they go to this charming little town that I recommend to all of you and hope none of you ever go to. You know how we are about things like that? Like, you know, you want people to go there, but then you also want to say, well, I liked that band before they were popular. Well, I went to San Gimignano before you. No, it's just a charming little town, and it's just in Florence, in the region of Florence, and it's a very dramatic town. It's a walled city, medieval city, and has all these towers, just these brick towers that just go straight into nowhere. They sort of stop at varying heights on the horizon there, and this is where Frank and Maddie find themselves. This is Frank. Hi, that's my niece. She's very nice. Then he remembered San Gimignano again, with its abandoned towers against the sky. He and Maddie had missed the last bus back to Florence, and so they had time to see the towers from every angle, in every light, from the maze of brick streets running through the town, from the olive groves on the hills surrounding it. This was their honeymoon. Frank had always imagined taking his wife to Italy on their honeymoon, even before he met Maddie. Tuscany was their favorite part of the trip, and the quiet streets of San Gimignano had felt like a refuge from the Florentine crowds. Still, around the middle of the afternoon, when more buses deposited their tourists and the sun's heat radiated from the streets, Frank and Maddie felt the need for an escape. And that was how they came to discover the statue, tucked in a shaded corner of a remote piazza not far from the city's north wall. Here, next to a fountain bubbling out of the building's side, was the statue of Mary, her feet badly deteriorated. Maddie had expressed concern. How old was that statue? And how could they let it reach such a state of decay? Weren't they afraid she would topple over? The statue's toes were long gone, the feet shorn off, not broken, but sloping from mid-arch to the supporting pedestal, completely worn away. Frank had offered what he knew of such things, a potential explanation, probable. People believed the statue offered help or healing of some kind. You pass by it, you touch Mary's feet, you say a prayer. Maddie sat on the lip of the fountain's pool, silent for a moment. Overhead, swallows swung through the sky. Still? She asked. Frank didn't know what she meant. I mean, do people still believe that? Still do that? Which marked a new conversation about healing, one less charged with emotion than when she had first told him about Vincent, but marked, Frank thought afterward, by a difference between them he hadn't been aware of, a difference, fundamentally, in faith. Frank said he supposed they still did, and Maddie had questioned the practice, defending her incredulity with respect for the statue's age. Couldn't they see they were damaging it? He replied that it was a difference in perceived value. What made the statue valuable wasn't so much its age or artistic merit, but rather its spiritual value. Here was connection to God. Maddie said that sounded medieval to her, and Frank chuckled. They both chuckled. The town's medieval towers were everywhere around them. Everything seemed medieval in San Gimignano. But Frank had pressed the issue. Yes, maybe it was a type of faith that was more dominant in the Middle Ages, but didn't she agree that God could also work that way now? God, merciful, all-powerful, unchanging. If he chose to heal people in the ancient world, if he chose to heal people during the Middle Ages, even through a statue, could he not, would he not, do the same thing now? The fountain bubbled, the swallows wheeled, and Frank looked at his bride, waiting for an answer. He was interested, almost curious. He didn't need her answer to be anything in particular. He knew what her answer would be. She would agree with him. Except that she didn't. She told him with certainty that she just didn't think God did things like that anymore. God didn't go around doing miraculous healings. He didn't do miracles these days. God worked through science. He let people figure it out. The problem came, she said, when people expected him to work magic, or when they looked at him as a means to an end, like they could use him to get what they wanted. Meanwhile, the Bible was clear on this. God was concerned with our souls, not our bodies. That was the whole point of the church, wasn't it? Saving souls. So that is another problem that I wrestled with in this book. I told you about my faith, and I will say to you further, it might interest you to know, this is not a Christian novel. Those of you in Dr. Harvey's class, we covered that territory earlier, but I didn't know this until I was trying to enter the world of the published author, but in order for a book to be a Christian novel, it has to meet certain requirements, and it can't have other components. And this book doesn't meet those requirements. And I wasn't sorry. I wanted to write a book that would invite people into the conversations that I have in my head about God, but I didn't want people to feel excluded because they didn't share my faith. And so that was part of my effort here. Nonetheless, this book wrestles with this question of what can we expect of God? What has he done? What does he do? What are we allowed to believe? What are we allowed to hope for? And that's part of what Maddie and Frank kind of work through in their separate ways over the course of the book. Another piece of it that I so enjoyed, and I know I mentioned to you already, is that Frank is Catholic and Maddie comes from a Protestant, and I don't know if you can call it a low church tradition, but a very informal, very emotionally charged church tradition. And I'm so pleased that my mother-in-law, Carolyn, is here. Can you wave? She and I have talked so much about, she is a faithful Catholic woman, and she and I have talked so much about Catholic practice. And there's much that I love about worshiping in a Catholic church. There's much that I love and have learned from that and from conversations with her. And it's a major piece of the book, is Catholic practice. And for Maddie, kind of reliving what she had learned as a Protestant and then coming into this new, and at this point she's been in it for 17 years. But we all know, I think, that there are things that you can live in and do and then suddenly have kind of an enlightened awareness of. And this is Maddie's experience. This is another moment in the book that is actually somewhat autobiographical, because there's a moment, and there's a passage in the book where Maddie goes with her mother-in-law to Eucharistic adoration. I'd never heard of this until Carolyn told me about it. But for those of you who are Catholic, or those of you who are not familiar, you may have heard, or it would be important for you to hear at this point, that in Catholic practice, receiving communion, which also I love, and Carolyn taught me that. In Protestant church, we say that we take communion, but in Catholic practice, they say we receive communion, which I think is infinitely the better verb there, which we can talk about later if you want to, but I'm just telling you now. It's a good verb for that. Just the idea of his gift to us is expressed there, I think, very beautifully. But the idea of transubstantiation, where at the prayer and in the blessing, they believe, yes, that the bread, Michael, you can also tell me, becomes the host. They call it the host because the bread is the host of the body of Christ. It's really an amazing, amazing thing. And so it is honored, the host, the bread, is honored in a way that is not honored in Protestant tradition. So Eucharistic, don't go far. I haven't seen her since October, so. Eucharistic adoration is a beautiful opportunity for Catholics to actually sit and pray in the presence of Christ, because they leave the host, blessed by the priest, and held specially there on the altar, and there must be someone there. You don't leave it alone. There's always somebody in the room, and so parishioners will sign up for a time and go in and pray there in the presence of the host. And Carolyn and I did this at about 5 a.m. It was a very beautiful experience for me. I'm grateful that I did that. In this scene, Maddie is recalling doing this with her mother-in-law. And in this scene, where I'm picking up, she has already watched the person. They go at about 4 a.m. Now, I should say that perhaps if you have Eucharistic adoration going on, then you don't necessarily need to sign up during the daytime because there might be many people there. But for those hours overnight, people sign up so that there will always be somebody there. So when Maddie and her mother-in-law go, there's a gentleman who was there before them, and he gets up and leaves. And I make reference to that here, so I just wanted to explain it to you. But this is, again, a new opportunity for Maddie to reflect on communion and what she has believed and what she's been practicing in light of sort of new revelation. She gave it her full attention. That only light coming from an unseen source in the ceiling was focused on it, shining down on the cross which was centered on the altar. If Maddie hadn't been told it was there, she would have missed it completely. But even from their somewhat distant pew, she could make it out. A matte disc at the heart of the ornate silver ornament that surrounded and held it in place. That was all it was. A dull circle of bread, maybe an inch in diameter. Even from a distance she knew it, having tasted it monthly for most of her life and now weekly since her conversion. She knew from experience its frailty, its thinness, how it would snap in two under the smallest pressure, how it melted so readily on the tongue. It seemed an insubstantial thing to summon them from warm beds before the sun was up in winter. Yet it summoned Peg every Friday, and presumably also that old man, and other people before him. It summoned people every day, every hour, generations of medieval monks and other faithful through the centuries. Now Maddie wondered what exactly she should do, other than bow her head. The Eucharist, had they called it that, in the Bethel Hills Church of Holiness, appeared only during the communion service. It made its way down the rows of pews in a wide saucer, and the discs of bread slid over one another like coins. The ushers moved along the ends of the rows and sent the saucers down them, then followed them with the juice, never wine, pre-poured into small plastic cups. All of it was prayerful and steeped in meaning. My body broken for you. This idea then of the conflict between Frank and Maddie over belief in whether or not Vincent could heal people gives rise to this other conflict that she has about what is God about with our bodies. Remember what she said on the lip of the fountain in San Gimignano. The church is about saving souls, isn't it? And here now, sitting in this church, in the pew next to her mother-in-law, she's looking at the body, the host, the Eucharist, sitting there, and she says, what does it mean? That was a joy for me in writing this book, and that's been so much a part of my faith. I was raised in a committed, beautiful Christian home. But as my mother has said to me, and I've heard her say to others many times, God has no grandchildren. We don't know him because our parents know him. We only know him because we know him. And so much for me, and I'll talk about this later tonight, so much of knowing him has been really thinking through what he gives us in his word, and what he says about himself, and sort of trying to make sense of that instead of just receiving it as language, which I think there's a place for that as well, right? Like music, like poetry, we can just be immersed in it sometimes. That's all we can take in. But other times we can process it. And I really enjoyed thinking through what it meant to receive this, to eat this, to drink this. What am I doing? And that's something that Maddie examines in this book. You guys are really well behaved. Either that or you're all snoozy, sitting there in the sun, sort of, oh, this is nice. I have no idea the time. How are we doing? 20 minutes, okay. Do I ask for questions or do I just keep going? What do I do? I have more for you. I'm just going to take a sip of this. Sorry. Thinking about the Eucharist, thinking about Christ saying that two become one flesh, had me then thinking a lot about our bodies and our physicalness. And I think that you can probably imagine how this idea then of Maddie being ill, desperately ill, and of Vincent having been able to heal people in various stages of need, how that physicalness of ourselves worked well in this story. There were so many pieces that I was working with, but I was so delighted and overjoyed and also sometimes really earnestly vexed at how they all worked together, to my mind anyway. So you see you have Maddie struggling with this disease. And I said again this morning in Dr. Harvey's class, I have not had breast cancer, and I thank God for that. I have dear friends who have been through that battle. It is not uncommon, sadly, and I am deeply grateful to the women who have been willing to share their experience with me. I know I said in Dr. Harvey's class that when I would write those passages, they were perhaps the most frightening passages. That and then the scene of a particular loss in the book was probably more troubling. But to write about her illness felt, it was very reverent for me because I just wanted so much to honor the people who have been through this process. There are many different, there are different types of breast cancer. There are different treatments for the different types, and also based on where a person is in the progression of the illness. I had to study and learn all of these things, not that I retain it, but because I really wanted to honor and be sure that I was being honest with this piece of the book that was not at all my experience. You see what I'm saying? It was very important to me to get that right. We live in in Durham, North Carolina. Duke University is a major research center for cancer. And I was so grateful that sitting down after the book came out last fall with a friend who is a cancer researcher, she said to me, I've read your whole book and I just want you to know you nailed it. And I was really grateful for that. I don't say that with any pride, to have been able to faithfully tell the story of a possible experience with this illness. So that is a theme that runs through the book. And I worried over that too, because that's heavy. Who wants to read a book about that? Well, I wanted to write one, so here's hoping you wanted to read one. But I was trying to do that as a vehicle for saying these other things that we've talked about. But of course, then that, again, works really well for this idea of Vincent being able to heal. And that's why I love that scene with Frank imagining going out to the football field right after Vincent has healed one of his opponents in a football game, and Frank being able to say to him, I need you to come back, I need you to come forward in time and heal my wife, your ex-lover. I need you to do this for me. If you have someone who is so desperately ill, and if you know someone who could potentially take that illness away, you would move heaven and earth, right? So to have this narrative in both of their minds in the background, I thought worked powerfully to motivate and push the story forward. Here is a scene when the church that they go to, because Vincent ends up joining Maddie's church, they catch wind of the idea that Vincent is a healer. And again, once you know you have a healer in your midst, wouldn't you just, when would it stop, right? Imagining that was interesting for me. At this point in the novel, there's a man who has been faithful in this church all of his adult life. He taught Maddie Sunday school when she was in the 4th grade. And now he has a brain tumor. He's desperately ill. He has been ill for a long time, but they are thinking now that he is potentially reaching the end. He is in the hospital. His name is Mr. Pavlik, and he is comatose because of the pressure of the brain tumor in his brain. His wife is there with him faithfully every day. And at this point in the book, the elders of the church have asked Vincent to come pray with them. This is all very tentative. They just think maybe there's been a moment where it looked like he healed a little boy in the church. And so now they're going to invite Vincent in and just ask him to pray for Mr. Pavlik. So this is the experience. And I want to say one more thing about it before I read it. A fascinating piece for me about the physicality of our illness is that it, of course, relates to bodies, as does the Eucharist, as does the enfleshed, incarnate God, and as is our sexuality. When Christ says the two become one, he's speaking literally, but he's also talking about something more that happens, the union of two people. And so what I'm working with in the scene that you can listen for is how Maddie kind of explores, without realizing it, the ugliness of our physicality, but also the compulsion of our physicalness. Our bodies drive us in ways that we don't always understand. And this is a problem for teenage Maddie, and also for adult Maddie. So here they are, gathered around Mr. Pavlik's bed. Vincent stands at the head of Mr. Pavlik's bed. He has his hands on his head. His head is shorn. There are scars from where they've done surgeries to try to help him. And then there are the elders around them. And Maddie is standing at the foot of the bed next to Mrs. Pavlik. And they've all been asked to put a hand on him as they pray for his healing. And much to Maddie's distaste, she's holding onto his foot under the sheet, and it makes her feel weird. I think that's fair. So here we are. Next to her, Mrs. Pavlik sighed. Maddie stole a glance at her face to see it red and tear-streaked. Her eyes were closed, but tears spilled from them nonetheless, and her lips were moving. Maddie considered the Pavlik's partnership. He was tall and thin. She was short and heavy-set. He was quiet, giving to making one laugh with his dry humor, but only if you hung around to listen. Mrs. Pavlik, on the other hand, talked constantly, so much that you found yourself tuning her out. She was the busy sort, always doing something. She was responsible for the kitchen at church and for many of the decorations in the church building. Even there in the hospital, she was constant motion, always fussing over her motionless husband, adjusting his blanket or his bedsheet, patting his leg, stroking his arm. During the prayer, she rubbed his foot vigorously, and briefly the blanket came away and exposed bare toes, long and somewhat yellowed. This unanticipated nakedness, innocent as it was, shocked Maddie. Suddenly she had a vivid sense of Mr. Pavlik's body there in front of her, all of it. his long limbs motionless, their muscles flaccid and sagging, his torso and the organs at work inside it, spleen, liver, lengths of intestine. He was unconscious, or maybe only sleeping, but his heart continued its mindless contractions, pushing the blood out to his extremities and drawing it back again. And what other crucial fluids pulsed among the membranes of tissue and bone? She marveled at the body as container, grossly complex and having far too many distasteful needs. Yet here Mr. Pavlik wasn't making use of his body at all. Something had taken root in the brain, had grown there, and now was commanding his stillness. For a moment, the idea that he should be living, lying there mute, blind, unmoving, seemed absurd. And yet she had seen that his toenails were neatly trimmed. Maddie could imagine Mrs. Pavlik bent over her husband's bare foot, wielding the nail scissors. She would have chatted away as she cut his toenails for him, now accustomed to his silence, but talking to him nonetheless, tending to the heedless growth of these nails. She would have thought nothing of the length of those toes and their hairlessness, or the yellowing of the flesh. To her, Maddie supposed, it was all familiarity, as customary to her as her own 2 feet. She probably didn't find it disgusting. Maddie did. She couldn't imagine fondness over such a thing. She couldn't imagine an aging lover. She couldn't imagine loving Vincent in any way other than the way he was now. Even if he were to age, which was almost inconceivable, he wouldn't age like this. Through the blanket, Maddie could feel the bony thinness of Mr. Pavlik's left foot, and she closed her eyes as if to shut the image away. She thought instead of Vincent's toes, which she had seen often enough. They were strong and brown, like his whole body had been during the summer. She remembered swimming with him and the tautness of his torso and the bulk of muscle in his arms. He had swum up and caught her from behind. He was pinning her arms against her chest, teasing and threatening to force her underwater, and she had screamed and struggled against him, but hadn't failed to sense his chest against her back. She had been acutely aware of that naked contact between their bodies, more than she was aware of his arms around her shoulders or his hands on her wrists. Even then, when everything about him had been new to her and when every physical interaction felt alive, she had wanted more. So I enjoyed the tension between, in this scene, the very physicalness, almost the medical physicalness of Mr. Pavlik's body, and the very real sexual tension that she feels for Vincent, both of which are true of ourselves, right? But one is pleasing to her, and one is one she wants to reject. That physicalness to her vexes her. I love that word, vex. Because she eventually comes to God and says to God, you make me the way that I am, and then you make me rules against the way that I am. What is that? And I think that's a legitimate question. I think it's one he probably expects for us to ask, and if we don't ask it, there's our trouble. So I will return now to the idea of the landscape of Pittsburgh, because that became another piece of the book that was so important. The landscape itself becomes a metaphor of a body. And that works on a lot of levels if you think about it. This is the space we live in, but this is the space we live in. Yeah? So both of them are our kind of tangible selves. And Pittsburgh, I think it was Dr. Harvey who said it this morning, it kind of becomes a character in the book. And that's very true. I would say more about that, but it gives away important things that I want you to potentially discover should you choose to read my book, which I would love for you to do. But I so enjoyed that. It was such a gift for me to get to write about the city. And I'm going to close, I think. Is it time? Someone tell me. Yeah? Okay, great. I don't want to just, that would be great to ask the questions. I'll read this last bit, which is also about the city, but it, again, this landscape becomes so important. At one point, Maddie and Vincent have told just 2 people that they think Vincent has this gift. It's their youth pastor and his wife, Nikki and Amy Tedesco. And Nikki and Amy don't scoff at it. They don't laugh at it. Instead, they say, "You healed a homeless guy? Let's go find him." And they get in the car and they drive into Pittsburgh to look for this man, to see if it actually took place. And this is that scene when you see the city taking on kind of a personality. They've been riding through the tunnel, so we're back at that place. And then the darkly lit tunnel spit them out. In all the excitement over Willie, that's the homeless person they're looking for, Maddie had forgotten this moment was coming, the shocking emergence into open air. It had always conjured in her a brief but fearsome sense of inevitability, For there was the tunnel's abrupt end, and then suddenly there was Pittsburgh, all vertical lines, shining glass, light. The bridge itself obscured its foundation. It rose before them out of nothing and consumed the horizon. And in both directions, other bridges also crossed the river's span, laid out like arms to pull you in. After hurtling through the mountains, she was now flying, unimpeded, helpless, into the city's burning heart, a heart made of glass, concrete, wire, light. There was no helping her. But happily, Maddie wasn't needing help. This was a harmless city, a safe one praised in the papers as great for families, a place where, for example, 2 teenagers could wander unaccompanied to a late afternoon baseball game and come home again safe and sound after dark. The breathless fear at the end of the Fort Pitt tunnel was only a game, some residue of childhood. She knew that now. But interestingly, the city actually is a very fearsome place for her, and she needs to come to a place of recognizing and contending with that. And I will leave it there and gladly answer questions if you have some. Yes?
So do you use the 3 rivers as a symbol for the 2 becoming 1?
Ah, you are so much smarter than I am. Yeah, so sure, excellent. He asked me, and I'll repeat my response too because that was hilarious. He said, so do I use the 2 rivers becoming one as the idea of the man and wife becoming one flesh? And I said, oh, you're so much smarter than I am. No, I didn't do that. Doggone it. Now I have to fix it. That and the typos. There's an appalling typo at the very, not I'm going to tell you where it is, but it's so appalling, and I can't fix it now. But that's so smart. Write books, okay? Yeah. Yes?
This is more of a practical question.
Sure.
Did you write in order of how it's read, or did you write kind of
What?
this part and this part?
Yeah, what a great question. She asked if I wrote the book in order of how it appears here, or if I wrote it in sections or, parts and parts and parts. That's a great question. First, I will say, if you are writing a book, I don't know of any strategy that works. I just think it's all hard. But I will say to you that no. That's my answer. I think what I did was I sort of had an idea of a shape of a story, and then I would write scenes that I knew needed to happen. And I'll tell you why. Because to write is so hard. It is so incredibly difficult that if you don't begin with something that interests you, it's all over. So you need to, I would say to myself, well, I know at some point Vincent needs to heal somebody that they can never prove that he healed. And so I came up with this idea of this homeless man that they had seen, was sort of in the same place again and again. But then after the healing, Maddie sees him one time, and then they never are able to find him. And that's a believable thing, right? So I wrote that scene and then went on from there and wrote other scenes. And I actually remember the day that I sort of started taking these pieces of paper and putting them in an order. And it was like I was afraid to breathe, like, will this work? Will this work? Will this work? And sort of laying these sheaves of paper and thinking, I think I have a chapter, but not knowing. And now I look back on that and I think, well, it's all so apparent. Like, this is obviously the way that it went. But there's nobody gave me a guidebook. It's like rearing children. Here's your baby, good luck. That's a great question. Maybe other people way smarter than me have a whole gorgeous outline and then just go to and fill it out. But that was not my experience. I have multiple outlines. But, yeah. That's a great question. Yes?
So did you start with the character of Maddie and put her in the situation of breast cancer, and then just let it evolve and where we go? You were risking not having a plot. You didn't know
Right.
where you were going to end up
Right.
when you started.
Great question. So he asked if I started with the character of Maddie, kind of the concept of her as a person, and then put her into the situation of having breast cancer and watch to see what would unfold. That was did I say that well? That's a great question too. Yes, and in fact, yes. And the idea of having her have breast cancer made me very uncomfortable, like I said. I knew that she needed to be at risk with her health, such that Vincent's ability to heal all of those years before would come to bear on this current situation. And yes, that's how it went.
You knew that Vincent was going to come back into it.
Right, in some way. Right, I knew that Vincent would come back in. Right, in some way he would matter in her present circumstance. And that was really the first tension that I was working with. Exactly, yeah. so many pieces. Yes?
At what point in the writing did you know you wanted to try to publish?
At what point in the writing did I know I wanted to publish? When I sat in Dr. Stansberry's class back in, what year would that have been? 1988? Yeah. And that's interesting. I knew I wanted to be a writer. And I knew that for me to be a writer meant that there would be somebody on the other end, like you are today, reading it. And so I wanted it. I wanted to publish. Yeah, that's a good question. I've had tremendous insecurity between here and there. And I will tell you, too, that even when the book came out, in the world of publishing now, you really have to promote your own work. And I'm very interested in this book, very passionate about it, but I was very intimidated by promoting it. I wanted just people to like it, just like the book, you know. And now I've come to a point that we're quite a few months from its release where I'm able to say, no, this is a good book and people should read it. And it's not about me. But I think at first I sort of conflated the book and myself, and then that felt weird, like not Christian, you know, like I shouldn't promote myself, which I'm not actually interested in doing. But yeah, that's a good question. Are you a writer?
I try.
Yeah, good for you. Yeah. Do you write fiction? I shouldn't put you on this spot, should I? Yeah, excellent.
And publishing is very hard.
It is. Although there are so he commented that publishing is very hard, there are so many more avenues for people to get their work out there now, which I think is great. I can tell you that story of how I came to publish mine, if I'm not. I have a friend from London. She's a very glamorous person. I won't go into the details, but I will tell you that she danced with Prince once. And I just was checking. Am I allowed to say that? Yes, because you don't know who she is. And she knows an agent in New York City who has a very successful literary agency. And I thought, great, so I know someone, right? Because that's what you need. You need to know someone. There are so many of us who are writing. How do I get my foot in that door? And so I went to Zoe's website and I followed her instructions to the letter with a little email saying, my friend is such and so. She said that you might be interested in my work. And Zoe read the manuscript that I sent, which was according to the guidelines that she asked for, and she wasn't interested. And I thought, that's fine. I know what I sent you is good. I know my book is good. I also know that you don't know who I am, that I haven't published in any magazines, that I have no kind of identity. I keep a blog that has been a great place for me to craft small pieces. I don't have a big following. I write it for me. But there's just nothing out there that has my name out there. And so I said, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to just pursue every agent out there. And instead, there's a small publishing house in my hometown, and I know the people who own it, and they love my writing from my blog. And I felt like it was humbling to take that avenue instead of some glamorous New York person, because I wanted to be flown in and be all important, because the other side of me wants very much to promote myself. Yes, I do. And I went with this small publishing house, and they have done a great job. And so that's how that came about. Yeah, but I knew people, see? But I know you, so I'll help you. I don't know your name, but I'm sure you're swell.
Just one last question.
Yep, I'd love to take another. Anyone? Yes?
This is a.
Oh, sorry.
She can go ahead.
Aw.
Now that you have it published, have you ever thought about turning it into a screenplay?
Oh, that's it. So she asked if now that I have it published, if I've ever thought of turning it into a screenplay. Right. So here's a confession about me. I am a terrible, terrible snob. It's horrible. And one of my very favorite writers is Annie Dillard. And Annie Dillard says in her brilliant, pithy little book, The Writing Life, that she doesn't like reading anything that sounds like it was written to be a screenplay. And some books are like that. You can read it and you can almost see the storyboard. And she said, you know, when I smell a screenplay, I smell a rat, she says. And I wanted very much to write a book that would not make a good movie, which is an odd ambition. My husband wishes it would be a movie, and a stellarly successful one, right? I wouldn't be opposed to someone else trying that, but I took Dr. Donnelly's film class, and all my efforts to do anything well in that class foundered completely. And I love good film, but somebody else, Ramesh, where are you? There you go. Here's your next project, right? I don't. So I've had people cast it for me, say who should play whom and that kind of thing, and I'd never like it. And so no. Oh, I think that's the answer. I am deeply grateful to you. I'm not pretending at all when I say how much it means to me that you all would come. Thank you so much. Oh, right.
We have them over here.
Thank you.